My first experience with Magic came in 2003. I was at a summer camp and a friend of mine introduced me to this game called Magic the Gathering. He let me borrow one of his decks to learn how to play. It wasn't anything flashy, it was a mono green deck that used Titanic Bullvox and Hundrug. After our first few games, I thought it was such a cool card game. I think that was because I learned the game using a green deck that to this day, I associate most with green Magic. By midsummer, I managed to get a hold of my very first theme deck. It was an 8th edition Heavy Hitters theme deck. The deck focused on ramping into big creatures like Spined Worm, Llanowar Behemoth, and perhaps one of my favorite pet cards to this day, Rocks. I loved using this deck, and even though I lost quite a few games starting out, I was hooked. As time grew, I began to modify the deck with some of the cards that I had managed to get a hold of. The deck slowly evolved into an elf deck, as I loved the way that green elves ramped into more mana than most other decks. And at the time, I didn't know what other formats were. The Magic the Gathering players around me all seemed to use decks built from whatever they owned. Modern wasn't even a thing back then. My deck had morphed into what I could only consider a poorly constructed Legacy Elf deck, if that. But it was fun, and at the time I was into Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, so it was fun to have another game to learn how to play. I won a few games here and there, and at one point, I'd even managed to get a hold of a legitimate Mox Ruby, but I stupidly traded it away at one point, a choice to this day I regret, as I had no idea that that card would be worth more than my entire collection. Whoops. By the end of my time at summer camp, my elf deck had a powerful card at its head, and perhaps one of my favorite cards to use in any deck nowadays, a Mirrodin Platinum Angel. A few years later, since I had few people to play against in high school, I mostly played against my brother or against myself. During my senior year, a friend of mine who was getting out of Magic decided to give me his entire collection. A lot of the cards were very old, but among them were some really cool cards that I still use today. Revised Sol Ring, Sensei's Divining Top, and Majawa's Jitte. But at this point, I really didn't have much of a playgroup to play Magic with regularly. Then came college. I found myself a group of friends who played Magic in actual formats and began playing Standard. This was about the time of the return to Ravnica Innistrad blocks, and I had built a deck that had combined Simic and Golgari +1/+1 counters with some graveyard shenanigans. It was about this time I had learned how to play Commander. My friend had let me borrow one of his decks to try out a game or two. In my first game, I got wrecked by a Storm Herd. By that night, I began building my own first Commander deck. It was a Risk the Redeemed Elf token deck, built mostly from one of my older elf decks. I grew to love the epicness of the format. The sheer explosiveness of the huge spells was everything I could ever want from a card game. I began to shift into being mostly a Magic player at this time. I later built the first incarnation of my Grand Arbiter Augustin deck, which became a tough contender in my playgroup and to this day is one of my go-to decks. When I transferred to a four-year university, Commander at that point was my main game. I was still developing more and more strategies as I got more and more into the game. I attended a few Friday Night Magics with some of my decks, as I still tried to keep up with Standard, but I was a broke college student drifting towards Eternal format, so that all the cards I owned I didn't have to keep buying into a new deck, so I ended up mostly just playing Commander. By my final year of university, I was relatively unbeatable using my newly built Rafik of the Many deck. It was at this time I had stumbled upon Magic the Gathering YouTubers who did deck tags, advice, and just general magic-y stuff. I found it beyond fascinating and watched it every chance I could. Channels like Tolarian Community College and The Mana Source invigorated me to push myself to be an even better Magic player. I learned strategies I never thought of before and was introduced to some of the best products for my decks. Now, I try to keep up with all the new sets, seeing what new exciting cards there are. I built myself an Innistrad styled cube and I maintain a library of several Commander decks. I also have a modern Merfolk and a modern green Infect deck, as well as a newer green Stompy deck. Recently, I've been getting a lot more into Pauper, mostly paper Pauper, but I do play it online time to time and I find the format absolutely fascinating. I did my first tech on Pauper Elves and have many more waiting in the wings. I spent hours on YouTube watching amazing channels like the Booster Tutor, Seeb and MTG, Magic the Amateuring, and Top and Go Productions. I've even tried watching competitive Magic the Gathering tournaments. And just this past April, inspired by the countless hours spent watching YouTube MTG, I begun my very own Magic the Gathering channel, which thanks to all of you amazing viewers has just surpassed 100 subscribers. It is an amazingly heartwarming feeling to be welcomed into the Magic the Gathering community like this. It brings me great joy to be a part of this wonderful community, and I'm so grateful to be able to share my experiences and knowledge of this game with all of you. So thank you so very much for 100 subscribers.